across this two-part program suggests that ritual abuse never happens. It's all a nonsense. It's all invented by gullible social workers or religious enthusiasts. And whilst I share some of his concerns that there has been generally very bad newspaper reporting of it, which tends to inflame things, and that some of the claims that have been made can't really be substantiated, what puzzles me in all of this is when I wrote the book, found a series of successful prosecutions of adult men and women in this country, in the United Kingdom, for the sexual abuse of children in what the courts heard were satanic rituals. That pretty much seems to me to answer the question, does it exist or not?
Yeah, very true. And here in the United States as well, we've had many convictions that haven't been tarred and feathered and kind of poo-pooed off the stage.
It is, I think, I work a lot in the States, but I can't speak to the prevailing mood, if you like, about child sexual abuse in the U.S. But in the UK, the public mood, as reflected in the media, is very ambivalent to reports of child sexual abuse. And we tend to try and shoot the messenger rather than listen to the message or understand the message, let alone investigate the message. And when you amplify that from, forgive the phrase, garden variety child sexual abuse to ritual child sexual abuse, there is virtually no serious, calm, secular examination of this. It polarizes people into one camp who says it's everywhere and everyone's at it, or the other camp who says it doesn't exist and you're all mad. And as ever with these things, the truth is pretty much in between.
Very true, because we know that a lot of it is not organized. A lot of it could just be, people with a fascination or a hobby that are just dabbling in this kind of thing.
Yeah. I'm guessing you've come across the same routine and really rather dull response from people who don't bother to look at facts but just react by saying it's all nonsense. They talk about conspiracies and conspiracy theories, and at the risk of sounding pedantic, it's probably one of the laziest insults that journalists reach for is conspiracy theory. And it's you're alleging a conspiracy. All a conspiracy is two people saying to one another, should we do this, and doing it. Yeah. And it doesn't have to mean some vast international vertical conspiracy.
Yeah, I follow your point there. Exactly. It's just two or three agreeing, conspiring together to commit a crime or to take on an action together in concert.
That's your basic conspiracy. I mean, you don't have to believe in little green men and aliens kidnapping people to say some conspiracies do happen. Frankly, Watergate was a conspiracy, wasn't it?
The days are getting shorter, and you can feel it in the air. Yes, it's that time of year. Pumpkin is finally back at Dunkin'. It's the cozy you've been craving all summer long, now in your cup at Dunkin'. Pick up all of your pumpkin favorites, like the signature pumpkin spice iced latte, or a pumpkin iced coffee, and bakery items like pumpkin donuts and muffins. Sip into something comfortable to celebrate the start of cozy season. Use the Dunkin' app for contactless ordering. America runs on Dunkin'.
Absolutely. And any more than two people, you're right. Any kind of agreement between the RICO convictions we have here, organized crime cases, are all conspiracy cases.
Of course they are. Yeah. And that's why it's, as a journalist, I find it disturbing how lazy some of my colleagues are. and they reach typically for this phrase conspiracy theory without ever stopping to think what it means.
And on the other hand, it's very concerning too. People who just like to hype, and like hype tabloid type journals, and just kind of.
Yeah, and that, I think I have sort of occasional arguments, public arguments with journalists here who say, when that sort of tabloid accusation comes out, this happened, this person did this in this place, and they're saying this on the basis of one complainant coming to them and saying, this happened to me, this is my story. Now that story could be accurate, it might not be accurate. My argument is, if you're a journalist, a responsible journalist, you don't just publish it, you investigate it before you publish it.
Which brings up the film Conspiracy of Silence. Now that was about the Omaha, Nebraska, the Boys Town. Now, you were involved with that, or you weren't?
I was. It was my film. I was working for what was then the best place in Britain, the best company in Britain, at making serious documentary films. It was a truly wonderful place to work and a great supportive environment. And it had been making amazing films for the British networks for some years, and I joined it, and I was able to make what I think are pretty good films for those networks. At some point, it did a deal with Discovery, the U.S. cable network, which wanted to buy the brand. It's this particular series that we produced of documentary films. And they bought the brand. It was called First Tuesday. And then the whole thing was going to be called First Tuesday on Discovery. And the very first film that Discovery commissioned was Conspiracy of Silence. And they commissioned it, and I remember to the end of my days the phrase of the commissioning editor, it's got politics, it's got pedophilia, it's got everything we want.
But in reality, whenever you have a story or a report that involves pedophilia, it's usually squashed here in the United States.
It's usually what, sorry?
It's usually silenced.
Well, Discovery were very keen. When we put to them for this new strand, this new series that they were going to run First Tuesday on Discovery, we put to them, I think, 13 ideas, and they commissioned only one at first, and that one was Conspiracy of Silence. They were red hot for this. So I and my colleague set off for Nebraska in the summer of 1993 to start investigating.
So can you describe what that story was in Nebraska?
Sure. The story as it was told to me, it came to me from a freelance who I'd worked with based in LA, and he said, I've got this story, you should look at it. The story is, as he told it to me, and this was the initial allegation that we were going to follow, was that in Nebraska there is America's favorite children's charity, Boys Town, immortalized in the great Spencer Tracy Hollywood movie, Boys Town. And the story was, the allegation was that Boys Town had been subverted in many ways by a man who prostituted children across Nebraska, some from Boys Town, some from other parts of Nebraska, and indeed had trafficked them for prostitution out of Nebraska and into Washington, D.C., where they serviced political clients on the Hill, essentially. That was the allegation. And by the time we got to Lincoln, Nebraska, which is where we set up our base for a month and a half, there were at that point, scandal surrounded 3 young people, a man called Paul Benassi, a young woman called Alicia Owens, and a young man called Troy Bonner. And they had made statements and given evidence both in court and to a Nebraska state investigative committee relating to the abuse of children and sexual abuse and trafficking of children in Nebraska and from Nebraska, and the Boys Town element as well. When we arrived, the first thing that made me deeply suspicious about how honest the law enforcement and judicial system in Nebraska was going to be and had been was the case of Alicia Owen. She was a young woman. She at that point was in prison. She was in prison for the crime of perjury. She'd been sent there by state court, not federal court, state court. And as I looked at this, her crime was naming in court, when asked to do so, her abuser, or her alleged abuser. The first tell, if you like, was that her sentence for this was 9 to 27 years. The second tell was that the crime for which she was sentenced didn't actually exist. Under Nebraska state law, not merely was it not a crime to name your abuser when asked in court, it was actually a crime not to name your abuser. So that's where we started.
And that's terrifying.
Yeah, I think so. The stimulus for all this being aired was a man who I thought then, I still think he was, incredibly brave. He was a lawyer called John DeCamp, and some of your listeners may know he's written his own account of this, and you should read his account as well as see what we did. And John represented Paul Benassi, and he was sort of representing Alicia Owen at that point. But there were two key things I needed to do straight away when we got to Nebraska. I needed to speak to Troy Bonner, was one of them, because Troy Bonner was a young man, one of the three, who had corroborated the stories of Alicia Owen and Paul Benassi, and indeed described his own abuse. So Troy Bonner was on my to-find list. The other thing I needed to do was to get hold of all the paperwork. Now, I say this with some mild trepidation. I got access to all the state legislators' internal paperwork, all the transcripts, all the tapes, and indeed some the tapes and transcripts of grand jury hearings. Now, I know I'm not supposed to have seen those, but I got hold of them. What they showed, other than very clear and convincing testimony about child sexual abuse in Nebraska, about children being abused at parties, trafficked and traded, not just within Nebraska, but also outside the state. What they showed was that these three young people, Alicia Owens, Paul Benassi, and Troy Bonner, were only the latest of the complainants, if you like. And there was a small number of complainants, of young people who had given evidence to the state investigator, recorded evidence. About 4 years earlier, and they'd been at Boys Town, they described the plundering of Boys Town for children. So I figured that my first port, I had to find these kids. They'd be young people. And I spent much of the ensuing 6 weeks trying to track them down. It sounds overly dramatic, but they had disappeared from the face of the earth.